Hello and welcome. This video is a Q&A. It's going to be pretty casual, and I decided to use some older footage that I have from a few years back when I still used to do commissions now and then. So the footage that you're going to see is of a commissioned piece that I did, I think in 2018. Anyways, as for the questions, I went over some of the questions you guys asked in my last video, and I just took a bunch of them and organized them in clusters that would make sense to be answered consecutively. And so let's get right to it. Okay, so the first question that I wanted to answer was about my comic called Gloaming Veil. And how I'm going to go about this is I'm not going to mention the specific people that asked the questions, and I am going to paraphrase some of the questions just to make them clearer. So yeah, the first question is Gloaming Veil going to be along the same lines as It Fracture, or was it completely scrapped and I'm starting over again? So it's a bit of a mix of both. I really wanted to keep as much of the original story I had intact, which is why I did keep a ton of, I guess, character traits, character situations, a lot of their backstories, but there's also a ton of new stuff that I ended up adding. So it's really a mix, but it's going to be told in a very different way. So it might feel like a completely different story, because even though I wanted to preserve a bunch of the same elements that I had in the original comic, I definitely have a different genre, like primary genre in mind. So I guess I'm going for something more like a drama, less so than just straight up comedy, because before what happened with It Fracture is that it kind of started as a straight up comedy and everything was a joke, and then eventually it got, for some reason, serious all of a sudden, which was a very crazy and radical change of tone, and as a result the whole thing was a bit messy. But yeah, I'm going to be aiming for something in between this time, and definitely not start it off to make it seem like a joke only for it to get serious later. Anyways, long story short, I am still writing it, obviously, so I can't answer exactly what it's going to be like, but there's definitely going to be a lot of the same type of stuff, but it just might not come up in the same order as it was presented initially. And obviously there will be a ton of changes. I hope that answered the question sufficiently, and thank you for taking interest. I will definitely be talking more about Gloaming Veil in the future, and I am planning to at some point do like an official introductory type of video where I just give a brief overview of what the project is and what my plans for it are, but I'll keep that for the future when it's a lot clearer to me. Yes, so on to the next one. Can you give some tips on how to approach VizDev, not just characters, but the overall look of the world you're creating for your story or project? So that's a really good question. I know that a lot of the times it can be super overwhelming to pick one spot to start with, and for that, I would suggest starting a Pinterest board. That's what I did when I was tackling my one large project, which was Grimoire Noir, the graphic novel that I illustrated that was written by someone else. So essentially there, I guess half the work was obviously done, as in the script was finished, but that gave me a very clear idea on, or I guess that gave me very clear parameters on how to approach the VizDev. So I guess that's one thing to keep in mind. It was definitely very straightforward to figure out the art direction and the VizDev, because the script was already complete. So in that situation, all I had to do was go over each chapter and write down every key location that comes up, take note of what the town is like, what the vibe is like that's trying to get across, like take notes of any important location details that might be relevant to the story. Things like that really help when it comes to visual development. And I didn't actually even do a whole lot of preemptive VizDev for the look of the world. Essentially, I just started a Pinterest board and filled it with photos that kind of capture shots of small towns or specific buildings or locations that I found would kind of suit the setting that was already established in the script. So that's how I went about it. And then when I got to the doing layouts for the actual comic, I just kind of figured it out on the spot. The only thing I figured out preemptively was the most commonly occurring, like the location that appeared the most and that the character returned to a couple of times, which was the main character's house. And for that, I just obviously did some quick research, picked some houses that I liked, and did a few sketches, narrowed it down, did a quick floor plan, and also made a very, very simple 3D model that I could easily turn and, adjust to the angle that I needed in a shot, and then just copy paste it into the layout and like trace over it to add all the details to make it look like the actual house. So that's a technically efficient way of approaching comics. So I know a lot of my friends who do similar things when with their comic work. As for people who are starting their own story and are like kind of in the middle of writing it like I am, I would say also start with a Pinterest board and just think about it a lot. Like for me, since I wasn't the one who wrote the story for the project that I have completed, it was not something I was stewing on, and so it was kind of like a very fast type of turnaround when it came to all the visual decisions, whereas the current story that I am actually writing myself, I've had years and years to think about it and think about the kind of vibe that I want, and so I have a relatively clear idea in my head of what I'm looking for, but I habitually save photos that I think would be a good reference for a certain location or any type of, interior settings. Like really a good way of going about it is just always having your story in the back of your head, so every time you come across something that reminds you of a certain scene or something that you want to include in your story, to just snap a picture of it or save it in a folder somewhere that you can later go back to, and then reference multiple photos and multiple locations to really create something that's new but also inspired by a bunch of things that have the vibe that you are going for. That's kind of what I'm doing currently. I haven't done any visual development for locations, but I kind of mildly started on characters. So a big part of visual development is just settling on what kind of style you want to go for, like what kind of look. It really helps to also have a folder of artwork that looks similar to what you want to be going for, that you can reference a lot when you're creating the overall look. So it'll likely impact your decisions when it comes to what brushes you're choosing to use, what kind of color palettes you're going to be aiming for. It could be any number of things. So I will generally have a folder where I'll just collect any type of art that sort of reminds me of the general direction that I want to go in. And one thing I'd advise against is kind of lingering too much on one artist. Be sure to find a ton of different sources of inspiration for your art direction. So hopefully that answered the question, and on to the next one. Okay, so for this next question, I'm just going to read the paragraph that this person wrote and answer each thing, like one thing at a time, because there's kind of a few questions hiding in there. So the text goes as follows. I'm struggling with the story that I'm writing. I have some ideas, but I can't decide on the world or the environment I want. The reality is that I'm a bit scared of having a boring story without interesting characters. I would appreciate if you can advise on how I can be more confident and sure about what I'm doing. So there's some really good questions in there, and the first one I'm going to answer is in regards to deciding the world and the environment that you want. So when you have a struggle with that, just think back on, I'm just going to assume that you already have some characters in mind. So when you have characters in mind and you have some sort of conflicts that they presumably have or something that they want, the world and the environment should really be a consequence of that. So you should decide on what kind of environment to give your characters based on what you want to happen to them, and have the environment dictate, or dictate isn't the right word. I guess, have the environment support the setting. So let me try to think of an example. Like, for instance, with me, I'm writing a story that takes place in a small town. I really like stories that take places in small towns. There are so many of them. Like, every other story takes place in a small town, and that's because a small town can be used as a microcosm for the whole world. I think it, but it also has a sort of an intimate quality, I think. And I mean, there's like a million reasons as to why that's an interesting setting and probably one of the most popular settings. I personally like it because my story is small and self-contained. It doesn't have to do with the entire world, and the characters only really stay in one place, and I wanted to create lore for this specific place, and I also don't want to be writing the history slash development of like an entire continent or an entire planet. So it's easier to give yourself smaller constraints. So if that I'm sorry, that was kind of a messy answer, but I hope that made sense on some level. Or if you're writing a smaller story, I guess your main environment can be a school or, I don't know, a village. It really depends on what you want to do with your story and what your story is about. So I don't really think you can come up with an environment first, because at the end of the day, stories are 99% of the time about characters. So you might want to start with the characters first and then figure out what environment would suit their story best. So next is the question of the fear of writing something boring without interesting characters. So that's a very, very understandable and relatable fear to have. I personally have thought about that a lot. Like, one of the things that sometimes cross my mind is that, like, the last thing I want to do is write some super boring, inconsequential crap that doesn't really resonate with anybody and doesn't mean anything to anyone. And I think it's pretty normal to have thoughts like that if you're of a certain type of personality, but it's probably best to just dismiss them and not linger on that aspect of things specifically, and instead think about what kind of story would make you want to read it, and only really focus on what's interesting to you personally. Because at the end of the day, if you're writing, you're probably doing it more for yourself rather than for somebody else. And generally speaking, if you focus on things that are really important to you and that actually really are meaningful to you, most likely a lot of other people will be able to relate as well and find some sort of meaning in your story if you just focus on making sure that it's genuinely about something that is important or interesting to you. So I would just dismiss the thoughts of being afraid that it's bad or boring. And also, you can definitely consult friends if you have any, or if you don't want to trust anybody in your close circles, you can always check out forums and maybe even share some ideas anonymously with people who might be willing to give feedback, because I also do understand that quality is something that matters, and that's why it makes sense for people to be concerned with how good their story is. And so getting feedback from other people and looking at it critically will probably help. I would say another way of approaching this is if you consume a lot of media yourself, so like if you watch a lot of shows or movies, read books, you should look at it from a critical point of view and try to note the things that you really like about it. Try to notice things that you specifically think make the stories that you like good, and then try to see if your story has those things in common or is successful at the things that you perceive to be good in other stories. I actually do that a lot. I don't necessarily compare my story immediately to the things that I look at critically, but I definitely take note of certain things, like especially things that don't work. I tend to really focus on stuff that I don't like about stories, because when I watch shows or movies, obviously when I don't like something, I mean, I know that a lot of people tend to just stop watching, but I have a tendency to watch something till the end to really see where something went wrong and what it is exactly that made me dislike it so much. So yeah, just I guess keeping an eye out on things like that and being critical about the stuff that you are interested in or stuff that you consume will definitely help in terms of shaping the kind of stories that you might want to write. And I think that's it for this question. So yeah, just have faith in yourself and focus more on the things you love. And if you focus on that, I think you're way more likely to have good results. And there's always books about writing as well. Like if you're super paranoid about your story just being really bad and boring, I suggest probably picking up a couple of books on how to craft a plot. And a lot of them have really good tips on that. So yes, that's always an option as well. Okay, on to the next one. Have you got any tips for when you are struggling to finish a piece and it doesn't feel like it's working? Do you ever restart, or will you force yourself to finish? So I am particularly stubborn when it comes to this aspect of making art. I will generally force myself to finish. That's what I do 99.9% of the time. In fact, there are very few pieces that I have started that I just decided to restart completely. And so my general habit is to persevere and just make the best of whatever is happening, especially when something is going wrong. I will usually do everything I can in order to fix it, or at least to make it or just to make it look like it's still working. I mean, obviously this is something that comes with time. Like when you have a ton of experience of making a ton of finished artwork over the years, like honestly I got most of my practice actually from doing commissions. So I started taking commissions when I was very young, like 15 or something, which is pretty ridiculous because I mean, I'm not going to judge myself on whether I had anything to offer at that time, but obviously somebody wanted a commission and I wasn't charging a lot back then either. But the point is, taking commissions, and especially when you charge less or when you're younger and you're just still starting out, it's a very good opportunity to discipline yourself to be able to finish something and to kind of establish the boundaries or the parameters of what you would consider a finished piece. So I figured out most of my standards, or the bare minimum slash the minimum expectations that I have for a piece that I would consider finished. So I personally have always had a bit of a over-polished approach to things as well, and as a result most of my process ended up being very step-by-step. So like step 1, finish sketch. Step 2, ink the whole thing, like make sure all the lines are in the right place, and then I would erase the sketch, and then next step would be to color in or to shade, etc. So it was very clear cut, and it wasn't like a very expressive type of process, and that's exactly the kind of process that makes it very easy to force yourself to finish. Even if something's going wrong, I would just figure out a way to cover it up and to keep going as a result. So because I find that when a process is really clear cut and you're not doing a whole lot of experimentation, and when you're making most of the major decisions at the very first step, which is the sketch, at which point you still have the option of erasing and changing things until you're satisfied to go forward. It's pretty hard to screw up. You just have to make sure you take the necessary time to finish the sketch and have it be good enough to go forward with the rest of the steps, which as a result turn out to be very easy. So yes, I guess that is... Did I actually give any tips? I don't know. I guess the tip would be to have a straightforward process, and I guess some other tips would be to just be patient with yourself and not get too frustrated when things are not looking the absolute best, or like, you know, I feel like maybe sometimes having expectations that are like way too high for yourself can actually make this process a lot more difficult, because if you expect way too much from yourself, like realistically, and you don't get the results that you expect right off the bat, I know that it can make the whole process very frustrating, because all you're feeling is that you're not good enough. So maybe a good tip for that would be to just adjust your expectations and to understand that it takes time to get to a certain skill level, and understand that it also takes mileage. So you might have to make a ton of art that you think is subpar until you get to a point where you think it's okay, and then 100 pieces later maybe you'll get somewhere where you think it's not bad, and you get my point. So yeah, I guess just be patient with yourself, and I guess also pay attention to the areas in which you tend to get stuck. So for instance, if I don't know, I can't really think of anything specific, but if you find that there's a specific area of a drawing that gives you trouble, and that's where you tend to get stuck and can't move past, I would just make some time to address that specific area and do some studies, read up on how to approach drawing that certain thing. Or I don't know, like for some people, I guess hands can be a problem, maybe it's backgrounds, I don't know, it could be any number of things. So yeah, if you just pay attention to what causes you to get stuck, I would just address that separately and then try to start over with the new knowledge. So yeah, hopefully that helped. The next question is, how do you get out of comparison mode and study art to increase your skill? Firstly, I think that they're two completely separate things and shouldn't necessarily be related to each other. So I don't think there's... Okay, first of all, just to break down the whole idea of comparison mode, obviously I don't know exactly what this person means by comparison mode. I guess it would be comparing yourself to other artists. So I think that the most prevalent attitude that I have been hearing about this particular issue in recent times in the art community would probably be to never compare yourself to others, and to just be a separate person and just mind your own business, and like just look at your art and stop comparing yourself to other people. So I think it's kind of unreasonable. I know that was probably a reductive way of summarizing what some current attitudes about that are, but regardless, I have seen people say things along the lines of that, and I do think that it's definitely part of it. So I guess I'll just talk about that first. So I do think that to a certain extent you have to understand that at the end of the day, art really is not a competition. So just because, especially, I guess maybe it depends on the specific goal that you're trying to reach with art. So perhaps, sure, if you are applying for a job, it is kind of a competition. There will be other people applying for the same job, and obviously only one person will get it. So that's a totally different scenario. Whereas in other cases, if you're just talking about posting art online and trying to start a small business, like selling merchandise with your art on it, etc., that type of thing, or like just posting it on social media and trying to gain a following, that is really not a competition. So like comparing yourself to artists that have a bigger following is pretty pointless, because I really don't think it does anything good for you. So that type of comparison I do think is completely pointless and should be eradicated. Although obviously I understand that it's not something that can be just completely ignored, because once in a while I obviously also have those thoughts pop up in my head, because I'm human, and I'll see someone else's account who's like much more popular, and it'll make me wonder about like what I'm doing wrong. But I kind of learned to not take those types of thoughts too seriously, just kind of let them pass and move on. I think the important thing is just not linger on it, because that'll just make the time you spend or the energy you waste on pointless thoughts like that, you might start to just get trapped in a certain cycle of thoughts. Anyways, back to the comparison mode question. So what I was going to say initially was that sometimes comparing yourself to others is not really that big of a deal. I think it's impossible not to, for whatever reason. We all just tend to compare ourselves, and I think that's also okay. There are instances in which it's fine. Like, it's fine to measure yourself or not yourself, but it's fine to measure your art against someone else. And in that case, it's just like I made the mistake of saying yourself. That's actually, I think, the biggest mistake that people do make when they do this, is that you have to, like, if you are going to look at someone else's art and look at yours and start comparing them, you have to understand that your art is not who you are. I guess obviously there's a relation there, but overall, how good or bad your art is doesn't have anything to do with your value as a person. And I know that might sound like kind of a vague statement. Maybe it's hard to understand how to separate those two exactly, but essentially you have to learn how to remove yourself to a certain extent from your work and be able to look at it in a strictly critical way. So in that sense, sometimes comparing yourself, comparing your art to other people is not the worst thing, because you can see, you can therefore reveal your shortcomings and just aim for better, like aim to be better, and there's nothing wrong with that. So in that case, comparison mode is not such a bad thing. Plus, when you're doing studies, like studying art to increase your skill often is about picking an artist who is a master and doing studies of their work and trying to learn what makes their work successful and then transferring that to your own art. So I suppose in a way there is some comparison involved. I don't know if that makes any sense, but yeah, so the follow-up question to that is, how do you approach character design, which is a completely different question. And I wonder if I should even answer that in one question or if I should make an entirely different video. I think I'm just going to make a video dedicated to that because it's such a broad topic and there's a lot of things I can say, and this video is going to get way too long if I actually do answer this question, so I'm just going to keep it for a future video and write it down. Okay, so the next two questions are kind of similar. So the first one is, posting on social media is the common way artists advertise themselves, but do you do anything else to promote your art? So the short answer is no. I don't do anything else. I only use social media, and I think I've experimentally bought ads this one time on Pinterest for like 2 days or something just to see what would happen for my shop, but it did not result in anything, and that thus concluded my attempt to buy paid advertising. So, I mean, as a business and as someone who depends on my business's success, I think maybe it would be a good option for me to look more into paid advertising, but it's not something that I've done thus far, and I do think that just posting my work on social media is enough for now, or it just seems to be enough, and if I just do that more, it'll probably be fine, and I don't think I have a dire need to look for other ways to promote my art. And the next question is, it's not really a question, it's kind of a statement, so I'm just going to read it. I want to use Instagram to promote my art, but I'm not sure my sketches have reached a good standing yet. How would you go about this? So there's a couple of things in this question that I want to address. First of all, if you don't think that your sketches are up to your standard, I don't know why you would want to promote them. I do understand that maybe it's just like a semantics thing. Maybe this person didn't mean to use the word promote. So if you actually mean promote, I think you only really promote your art when you have a product to sell or if you want to get clients. So that's an entirely different thing. Like if you feel like you're at a point where you are hireable or you have something to sell to try to make a living or start to make your own business, that would be promoting. So that's different. And in that case, you just have to have faith in yourself and your abilities. But if you just mean to promote as in to just post your art on Instagram, I would say people really like seeing others' progress, and I don't think any time is the wrong time to start posting on social media or sharing your artwork online. I think that showing others your growth is a very valuable thing. Like, I mean, I guess essentially that's what I did. And it's not something, admittedly, it's not something I thought about a whole lot when I started first posting / sharing my artwork online, because I was young enough that I didn't really consider it. It just seemed like a fun thing that other people were doing. So I was like, okay, I'm just gonna do this too. And honestly, I think that's the best way of starting out, because you don't want to stress yourself out with trying to judge your level of progress or trying to match up with some sort of standard. Just find whatever it is that you think would be fun about sharing your art or posting it online, and just do that, and then see where it will take you and see how your art will grow. And first and foremost, just focus on whatever is important to you. So whether it is like making, like, I don't know, drawing your characters, or some people want to focus on improvement, which is awesome too. Like, you can just do studies and post them and just share your progress, etc. And yeah, not to focus too much on like the details, unless, like I said, you want to build a business, in which case you might want to just do some research into that, and that would be a completely different question. So the next question is, what is the main thing that inspired you to start drawing when you were little? It's always something that was one of my favorite things to do, and I might have mentioned this before, but my family immigrated to Canada when I was 11, and I did not know any English at first, and so I mean, it was really boring going to school. I was never a huge fan of school anyways, but this was like extra boring because I couldn't even understand what the teachers were talking about. So I just drew to pass the time because it's something that I like to do. So I guess that's kind of what inspired. I wouldn't go as far as to say as it inspired me, but I just did it out of boredom, and obviously it was a lot more fun than just sitting and trying to listen to a language that I don't even understand. And then it really kind of stuck as a habit, so I was just doing that a lot in those years. And probably it was the thing I spent the most time on in my teenage years, and probably like honestly probably my whole life. Okay, so alright, so the next couple of questions were a bit similar, along the lines of how I set up my workspace to the right position without getting tired, and have I found the right direction and position to use my brushes. I don't know exactly what that means, but I'm assuming it has something to do with my work setup in relation to health problems. And the other question was, do I have some kind of stretching routine before drawing, stay in a particular position, or use some kind of ergonomic chair or desktop for sitting while drawing. This person has back pain because of their bad posture. That really sucks, man. I sympathize. And just wanted to know if what do I do with that kind of stuff. Okay, so I actually have no answer to that, because unfortunately I don't have any specific ways of like set up to combat art related health problems. The best that I try to do is I try to do like 30-minute workouts 3 times a week. Sometimes I'm successful, sometimes not, but it is definitely something that I attempt to do every week for general health upkeep. But aside from that, I mean, I don't know, I try to like stretch and stuff, but I don't do anything specific to prevent back pain. And sometimes I actually also get back pain. More specifically, I get like pain in my tailbone that drives me nuts. I had it for like, I think it kind of is subsiding right now. I don't even know why, but it was bothering me so badly for like 2.5 weeks straight, and I have no idea what caused it. Probably from like bad posture from sitting. So all in all, I don't have any solutions for this, and I should probably look into it myself. So I'm sorry, that was completely pointless. If anybody else has tips on how to deal with like bad posture and back pain as a result, I would love to know as well. All right, next question. I have seen your videos of you warming up with anatomy sketches before you really get to work with your art. How do you exactly apply what you've learned from your quick sketches of anatomy studies to what you're going to be drawing? I've been trying to get better at anatomy for a few months now, but whenever I try to apply what I've learned to my art, I would always have to come back and practice more without really improving. Any tips? Okay, so I do have actually a bunch of stuff to say on this particular topic. So this is something that I found myself thinking about when I just started doing life drawing back when I went to college for animation, so in first year of animation. This was like years ago, but I do remember that it was a bit of a hard, like I had a hard time transitioning what I learned from life drawing into my actual work. I mean, maybe that's just the way that I perceived it, but that is how I felt, because in the art classes with the life model and the life drawing classes, we were expected to use these huge drawing pads with Conte crayon. I don't know if everybody would know what that means exactly, but it's basically just like this piece of very dense chalk like art material that you have to hold in a very specific way that's like completely different from a pencil or like a pen. And obviously the scale of the drawing was also radically different from how I usually draw, and you could make such a big variety of marks with that tool that essentially I found myself wondering how that would even translate into my regular art at all, because it just seemed so different. So I can see how that's something that might be an issue with studying anatomy and being unsure of how to apply it. So firstly, I think it's important to note exactly what you are studying. So for instance, anatomy is a very broad term. I would say you'd have to break it down to posing, maybe muscles, maybe the skeletal structure. My point is, you have to pick a specific thing that you're trying to study. So that being said, the videos that you have seen of me upload before with like my real-time anatomy warm-up studies, drawing gesture drawings, whatever, so those for me serve a couple of specific purposes, and that would be to just warm up my hand, which helps a lot when it comes to drawing later. Unfortunately, I don't actually warm up every time before I draw. It's something I should do, but unfortunately I don't get around to. Anyways, the point is, warming up your hand is a big part of it, so that's partially why I think it's really important to do that. But secondly, I mostly focus on gesture studies that are not very anatomically detailed. So as you may have noticed, they're relatively stylized, and that's because I approach it from the specific direction of learning or sharpening my skill on doing very fast but general figures. So that was probably a needlessly complicated or needlessly lengthy way of putting that, but essentially that's what gesture drawing is. It just warms up your hand, and it forces you to retain things like proportions and just being able to get down a figure on a piece of paper quickly, and being able to communicate the gesture, which is the most important thing. So being able to communicate a pose or some sort of emotion, or you get what I'm saying. So that's the purpose of the anatomy studies that I do, and how I can directly translate that into my work right off the bat is, first of all, I can always flip through my sketchbook and find a pose that I like and just use that pose to draw my character in, because usually when I do these things, they're very general. They don't focus on specific facial features, and I'm not trying to get a likeness of the person that I'm drawing from the reference photo, or to even get their very specific body type down. Sometimes I will just draw a generic body type, but what I'm focusing on is capturing the pose, because that's how I start all of my character art. I will just do a quick pose, and then I will focus on putting in the details afterwards. And the same goes for comics. It's a very, very useful skill to have when you're drawing comics, because then you can just quickly jot down all the gestures and just read through the layouts to see if the story communicates properly and you can tell what's going on. So essentially, the skill that you're trying to develop while doing stuff like that is to be able to draw a pose quickly. Yes, so that was a very, very long answer, and I suppose I didn't really say a whole lot, but that is how I apply what I learn into my art. So the most important thing is to know exactly what it is you're trying to get out of your study sessions. So for instance, if I were to draw hands, I would not try to draw realistic hands. I wouldn't try to copy the reference photos or anything like that. What I would do specifically is to draw hands in a stylistic way that would match the types of characters that I draw, like their proportions. So maybe it would be a good idea to study other people's art alongside of actual photos for reference. And that actually takes me to the next question, which is directly related. And this question is, how do you know how to simplify reality? When you draw, example, a tree or an expression or clothes, you and other illustrators seem to know exactly how to convey the feeling of it all with only a few lines. You seem to know what makes a tree look like a tree and what makes annoyance look like annoyance, etc., without needing all the detail of photorealism. How do you learn that? Okay. The answer to that is very similar to the thing that I was talking to right before reading this question, and that would be studying other people's art. So when you want to learn how to simplify, the fastest way you can do so is by finding another artist whose way of simplifying things you find effective. And I would suggest finding many artists that do this. Maybe start a folder, gather a bunch of images that you think are super successful at this, and then just analyze it and make studies. That's how you learn how to simplify. So I know that this is kind of irrelevant and a little bit like just a super tangential topic, but it is kind of related, I find. I think it is actually very difficult to successfully simplify things. I think it's more difficult to do that than it is to do photorealism, because photorealism is very straightforward, and essentially your biggest goal is just to duplicate something one-to-one, especially when you have a photo reference. To me, that seems like the most straightforward thing, because you don't have to change anything. You just have to really see what you see and then just duplicate it. Whereas simplifying requires a lot of decisions, and to simplify something and also make it good and make it clear takes a lot of skill, a lot. So in order to gain those skills, I would highly recommend obviously hitting the fundamentals, which will definitely help, because knowing the structure of things is pretty much required if you're going to modify them using your imagination. But secondly, the most helpful thing to do is to study other people's way of doing things like that. So to just find specific things that you think are very effective about their work and their way of simplifying things, and just breaking them down, trying to find patterns in other people's styles. And that's kind of, it's very related to a person's style. I would say that that's what makes someone's work recognizable, is that there's usually a pattern of certain choices that they make throughout their artwork that's reoccurring, and the combination of those patterns is what makes someone's work recognizable, and it usually obviously involves some sort of simplification or stylization of reality. I don't know. That sentence kind of got away from me, but you know what I mean. So yeah, hopefully that helped, and I actually wanted to mention that I do think it's a really, really interesting topic to discuss how to break down somebody else's style exactly, and it's a video that I'm planning to make in the future. So I want to explain how I go about picking somebody's artwork and then breaking their style down in a way that I can understand, and trying to figure out what exactly makes it look good to me and what it consists of. Yes. So this video has gotten pretty long, and I think I'm pretty much ready to end it here. There's a couple of other questions that I didn't answer yet. Maybe I can just do them quickly. One of them is, how many hours a day or a week do I draw, and did I used to draw more or less? I would say there were definitely times in my life when I drew more, for sure. So I think overall, right now, I draw less than I used to. But that's something that I'm really trying to change. So, and how many hours a day or a week do I draw? It varies wildly. So if I have something going on, like a shop sale where I have to pack orders and prepare my stuff, then sometimes I can like not draw for a whole week. That has happened a lot in recent years. So yeah, like I said, it's something that I'm not a huge fan of, and I would definitely like to draw more, so I'm trying to change that. There's also a question about planning, so as in do I plan my illustrations, and if not, when do I feel that it is needed and how extensive it is. It really depends. Usually I don't, like, all my planning usually happens within the thumbnail, so I suppose that counts as planning. I'm not a huge fan of doing multiple thumbnails, but sometimes when it's a more serious matter, like a cover for a book or like a big important illustration, then I will obviously put more time into planning it. So it really depends on what you're doing, but most of the random stuff that I do for fun or smaller illustrations that are not for any particular grand purpose, those I don't do a whole lot of planning on generally. But I also made a video recently about how I plan things. It also depends on the complexity of the illustrations, so yes. Okay, so 2 more questions. Can I do it? Yes, I can. Question: would you ever consider illustrating someone else's comic/graphic novel if they pay and the deadlines were worth it? I'm gonna say no, unfortunately. As much as I would love to work with someone else again or help somebody else achieve their dream, I think at this point I just owe it to myself to focus on my own projects and only focus on that, and I anticipate that it's going to take me a very long time to complete my own things, so I'm not in a position where I can really commit to any other side projects. In fact, I've been spending the last several years gearing up to this point where I no longer have to take any outside work, and I'm very happy to have gotten to this place. So sorry about that, but that's just how it currently is. And yes. And the last question is a pretty interesting one. I am running out of energy rapidly, and I think my throat is starting to get dry, but I'm just gonna try to answer it as concisely as I can. I think it's a good and interesting question, and it is: do you ever feel like your art is not your own, like somehow your idea or creation is fraud because of how similar it seems to the art of other artists? Yes, I do feel like that, and actually the reason why I wanted to answer this question is because to me it's very closely related to the phenomena of feeling visually overstimulated by other people's art. Consuming too much of other people's art is what usually causes me to feel like this, and it generally creates art block, and it makes me like not want to draw. So yes, it is definitely something that I experience. I used to be more intense about stuff like that and like more upset than I would be these days, just because I have learned how to let thoughts go. So like I've mentioned somewhere earlier in this video even, it's a really important thing to learn how to just let a thought pass. Like you don't even have to argue with it, you know? Like you can just be like, well, yes, that's the thought that I just had, and now I'm going to move on with my life, and that's it. Like you don't really need to even like invalidate the thought or try to come up with a reason as to why it's wrong. You just have to understand that sometimes you will be in a bad mood, or sometimes you will just perceive things negatively for whatever reason. Maybe there's a completely unrelated external factor that made you feel shitty that day, and thus you will just see things in a negative light. So it's important to remember that it's a toxic thought to have. Being worried about your art being somehow fraudulent just because it looks like somebody else's is pretty absurd. There are a ton of people with similar art styles, but then there is also differences. So it's really something that you shouldn't linger on, because you have to understand that it's not a valid concern. There will always be people out there whose art is similar to yours and vice versa, and that doesn't mean it's any less valuable, doesn't make it fraudulent. Like, I mean, unless you're like straight up tracing somebody else's work, chances are there's more value to your art than you think if you tend to be down about it all the time. So yeah, I would say just try to let the thought pass. And when I feel like this personally, I try to step away from social media. I think for me, the major cause of feeling like this specifically is just, first of all, feeling uninspired being kind of bored or trying to procrastinate, then as a result going on social media, catching up with whatever everyone's up to, and then seeing a bunch of other people's posts, I'll immediately think about like, oh god, like how come they're so productive and I'm not productive? And then I will see a bunch of art that starts to look similar to me, and then I will think about how annoyed I am with the fact that everything looks so similar, and then I'll look at my own art and I'll realize that it also kind of looks like that, and then I'll think about how, god, what's the point of even making art because it all looks the same anyway and it's all really annoying. And that's the point where I know I'm just at a total visual overload. Like, I should not be looking at anybody else's work or my own and just do something completely unrelated, like go cook a nice meal or like read a book or just watch a TV show or something, and it'll just pass. So that's usually how I handle that type of situation, and thankfully it doesn't happen too often. But yeah, like I said, usually being idle and being bored and then using social media as a tool for procrastination is a recipe for disasters such as these. Okay, so at this point I'm pretty much tapped out, and I do think I managed to, for the first time, answer all the questions that I wrote down. And yes, so thank you for listening to this video or hopefully watching it, and I will see you in my next one. Bye.